December 1941. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. Snow falls in thick curtains across the battlefield near Volokholamsk, muffling the distant rumble of German artillery. The air tastes of gunpowder and pine needles, sharp against frozen lips. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Kozlov adjusts the headphones around his frost-bitten ears, fingers dancing across the radio dials with practiced precision. The communications bunker, carved deep into frozen earth, vibrates with each incoming shell. Kerosene lamps cast trembling shadows on maps pinned to wooden boards. Watch this story unfold as we discover how Soviet ingenuity changed the course of World War II. Kozlov has been manning radio station R105 for 18 straight hours. His uniform, stiff with ice crystals, bears the insignia of the 316th Rifle Division. Around him, 3 other operators work their equipment. Junior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov, barely 19, whose steady hand belies his youth, and Sergeants Mikhail Volkov and Ivan Semenov, veterans who joined the Red Army before the war began. The metallic crackle of incoming transmissions fills the cramped space. German intercept stations have been monitoring Soviet communications for months, breaking codes with methodical efficiency. Wehrmacht units move with uncanny precision, always seeming to anticipate Red Army maneuvers. Soviet commanders have grown suspicious. Their battle plans leak like water through a sieve. Petrov removes his headphones, frustration etched across his angular features. They're listening again, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. Same frequency as yesterday. His breath forms small clouds in the bitter air. The fascists decode our transmissions faster than we can send them. Kozlov studies the frequency logs spread across his makeshift desk. Pattern recognition was always his strength. Back in Leningrad, before conscription, he taught mathematics at the Polytechnic Institute. Numbers told stories for those who knew how to read them. These German intercepts follow a rhythm: capture, decode, respond, usually within 40 minutes. The bunker's wooden support beams groan under the weight of accumulated snow above. Volkov, a stocky man from the Urals whose calloused hands speak of factory work, adjusts the main transmitter's antenna connection. Static clears momentarily, revealing cleaner signal reception. "Comrade Kozlov!" Semenov calls from his position near the emergency radio set. "Command wants operational updates every 2 hours. But if the Germans keep intercepting..." He doesn't finish the thought. Everyone understands the implications. Kozlov stands, pacing the bunker's narrow confines. His boots scrape against the frozen dirt floor. Through the small observation slit, he watches Soviet infantry positions being shelled with devastating accuracy. The enemy knows exactly where to strike. A memory surfaces. His professor at university, an old Bolshevik named Dmitry Orlov, explaining cryptographic principles during a guest lecture. The strongest codes, Orlov had said, are not those with the most complex mathematics, but those that use languages the enemy cannot comprehend. Suddenly, Kozlov stops pacing. An idea forms, audacious in its simplicity. He turns to Petrov, whose family originates from Kazakhstan. "Alexei, you speak Kazakh fluently, yes?" Petrov nods, uncertain where this leads. "My grandmother insisted we learn it at home." "But what does that matter here?" "Everything," Kozlov replies, his voice gaining urgency. "The Germans have linguists for Russian, Ukrainian, even Belarusian, but Central Asian languages." He moves to the radio equipment, mind racing through possibilities. "Volkov, you mentioned your wife is Tatar. Do you understand the language?" Volkov's weathered face brightens with understanding. "Enough for basic communication, comrade. My children are bilingual." Kozlov's plan crystallizes. The Soviet Union encompasses dozens of languages, dialects that German intelligence services have never bothered to study. Languages spoken by millions of Soviet citizens, but completely incomprehensible to Wehrmacht codebreakers. Outside, another artillery barrage pounds Soviet positions. The bunker shudders, dirt cascading from the ceiling. Emergency reports flood in, casualties mounting, ammunition running low, morale wavering. But Kozlov sees opportunity within catastrophe. He gathers his operators around the central radio table. Maps of the front line spread before them, marked with red pins indicating German breakthrough points. Gentlemen, we're going to change how this war is fought. The fascists expect Russian. We'll give them something they've never heard. Semenov, whose family fled the Civil War from Georgia, speaks fluent Georgian alongside Russian. 4 operators, 4 different linguistic backgrounds. Kozlov begins sketching a communication protocol on the back of a supply requisition form. The plan emerges. Operational messages transmitted in native languages, following predetermined codes that only Soviet forces would understand. Simple phrases carrying complex military information. Grid coordinates disguised as family conversations. Troop movements hidden within discussions of livestock and weather. Petrov tests the concept, switching between Russian and Kazakh on the practice frequency. The transformation is remarkable. Familiar military terminology becomes completely alien to outside listeners. German intercept operators would hear unintelligible syllables where once they found tactical intelligence. Kozlov knows this could work. More than work. It could save the entire front. But implementation requires approval from divisional command, training for other communication units, and absolute secrecy. The Germans must never discover this new system exists. He reaches for the secure telephone connecting to headquarters, hand pausing over the receiver. This moment could change everything. The metallic taste of possibility mingles with the persistent flavor of gunpowder in the freezing air. As he prepares to make the call that might alter the war's trajectory, Kozlov remembers his professor's words once more. The strongest codes use languages the enemy cannot comprehend. Tonight, the Soviet Union's greatest weakness, its linguistic diversity, might become its most powerful weapon. The static crackle of radio waves filled the underground bunker as Captain Viktor Petrov adjusted the frequency dial with practiced precision. Above ground, the siege of Stalingrad raged through its 4th month, but 30 feet below the rubble of what once was a library, Soviet radio operators worked in methodical silence. The metallic taste of recycled air mixed with the acrid smell of overheated vacuum tubes. Petrov observed Senior Lieutenant Alexei Kozlov hunched over his telegraph key, tapping out sequences that would have puzzled any German cryptographer. The rhythmic clicking echoed off concrete walls like an irregular heartbeat. Kozlov's weathered fingers moved with the fluidity of a pianist, but the music he created was mathematical poetry. Navajo code words transformed into Cyrillic script, then encoded again through Soviet military ciphers. The concept had emerged from desperation and brilliance in equal measure. 3 months earlier, Colonel Dmitry Antonov had studied captured Japanese intelligence reports from the Pacific Theater. American Navajo code talkers had proven unbreakable to Imperial Japanese cryptographers, their indigenous language providing natural encryption. Antonov proposed adapting this strategy using Soviet minority languages, Yakut, Evenk, and Chukchi speakers recruited from Siberian units. Kozlov finished his transmission and removed his headphones. The thin fabric left red marks around his ears. He turned to Petrov, his voice barely above a whisper. Message confirmed, received at 62nd Army Headquarters. Counterattack coordinates for tomorrow's dawn offensive. Petrov nodded, making notations in his logbook. Each entry recorded transmission time, frequency, and operator identification. The Germans had sophisticated radio direction finding equipment, but their linguists possessed no knowledge of languages spoken by fewer than 50,000 people scattered across the Arctic tundra. Even if they intercepted transmissions, the words themselves formed an impenetrable barrier. Private Dmitry Nerkagi, a Nenets reindeer herder from the Yamal Peninsula, spoke into his microphone in his native tongue. His message described artillery positions using terms for seasonal migrations and hunting grounds. To any eavesdropper, it sounded like casual conversation about weather patterns and caribou movements. In reality, he coordinated tank movements for the upcoming assault on the grain elevator. The bunker's single electric bulb flickered, casting unstable shadows across maps pinned to wooden boards. Red pins marked German positions, blue pins indicated Soviet units, and yellow pins showed contested areas that changed hands daily. Petrov traced supply lines with his finger, calculating ammunition requirements and evacuation routes for wounded personnel. Senior Sergeant Yelena Volkova emerged from the communications booth, telegraph transcripts in hand. Her uniform bore the stains of 48 hours of continuous duty. She approached Petrov with urgent messages from the Northern Front. The Germans had launched a massive offensive near Lake Ladoga, attempting to sever the last supply route to besieged Leningrad. Volkova spread the decoded messages across Petrov's desk. The situation reports painted a grim picture. German armor had broken through Soviet defensive lines, advancing toward the railroad junction at Ma. If they succeeded, Leningrad would be completely isolated, its 3 million residents facing starvation before winter's end. Petrov studied the tactical maps, correlating radio reports with known German capabilities. The enemy possessed superior equipment and fresh reserves, but they lacked understanding of the coded transmissions coordinating Soviet resistance. Every German intercept yielded meaningless syllables. Chukchi discussions about seal hunting that actually detailed sniper positions. Yakut conversations about ice fishing that coordinated artillery barrages. The bunker's ventilation system wheezed as it circulated stale air through buried corridors. Somewhere above, mortar shells exploded in rhythmic patterns, shaking dust from concrete ceiling beams. The operators continued their work with mechanical precision, transmitting coordinates that would determine the fate of entire divisions. Kozlov returned to his station, adjusting his headphones before beginning another transmission sequence. His message contained detailed intelligence about German supply convoys moving along the Volga River. Information had been gathered by reconnaissance units operating behind enemy lines, risking capture to observe enemy movements. The static-filled response came through speakers positioned around the command center. Another operator, stationed with the 24th Army near Kalach, confirmed receipt of the intelligence. Within hours, Soviet aircraft would intercept the convoy, disrupting German logistics for the southern sector. Petrov made additional entries in his logbook, documenting the successful transmission. Each successful message represented lives saved and tactical advantages gained. The Germans possessed superior technology and numerical advantages, but they could not decode languages that existed only in the memories of Arctic hunters and nomadic herders. As dawn approached through the bunker's single periscope, the radio operators prepared for another 18-hour shift. The siege showed no signs of ending, but neither did their resolve to maintain communications across the fragmented front lines. The clicking of telegraph keys resumed, sending unbreakable messages through the frozen air of a Russian winter that would test both armies to their breaking point. The blizzard struck the Königsberg sector without warning on February 14, 1945. Wind howled through the abandoned German artillery positions, carrying the acrid smell of cordite mixed with burning wood from the distant city. Lieutenant Alexei Petrov adjusted his headphones as snowflakes gathered on the radio equipment, their metallic surfaces already slick with ice. The crackling static filled his ears. The same electromagnetic symphony he had learned to navigate since Stalingrad. But tonight, something felt different. The Japanese intercept stations had grown bolder, their directional antennas sweeping frequencies with methodical precision. Behind him, Senior Sergeant Dmitry Volkov worked through another encryption sequence, his calloused fingers moving across the cipher wheel with practiced efficiency. The wooden device, no larger than a dinner plate, contained secrets that could shift the balance of the Pacific War. Yet its modest appearance betrayed nothing of its revolutionary purpose. Petrov pressed his pencil against the transmission log, recording signal strength measurements as Volkov prepared the evening's operational directive. The message would travel 4,000 kilometers eastward, carrying troop movement details that General Rokossovsky needed delivered to the Maritime Province Command. Standard military traffic, except for one crucial detail the Japanese monitoring stations would never detect. The cipher contained no Russian words, no Cyrillic characters, no Germanic loanwords that German cryptographers might recognize from their Eastern Front experience. Instead, Volkov had embedded the tactical information within a linguistic structure completely foreign to both Axis intelligence services. Signal strength optimal, Petrov reported, watching the needle dance across the receiver dial. Atmospheric conditions favorable for long-range transmission. Volkov nodded, positioning his hand over the telegraph key. The brass contact felt cold against his fingertip, the same sensation he remembered from his childhood telegraph lessons in the Siberian mining town of Magadan. His grandfather, a telegraph operator for the Trans-Siberian Railway, had taught him that metal always remembers temperature. Tonight, the equipment would remember more than cold. The first sequence began with traditional Soviet military protocol: call signs, authentication codes, timestamp verification. Any intercepting station would recognize standard Red Army communication patterns. But embedded within this conventional framework lay something unprecedented. Volkov's native tongue was not Russian. Born in the remote Kamchatka Peninsula, he had learned his first words in even, a language spoken by fewer than 8,000 people across the Soviet Far East. The reindeer herders and coastal fishermen who comprised his extended family had preserved linguistic traditions older than written history. Their vocabulary contained concepts for which no equivalent existed in European languages. As his finger pressed the telegraph key, Volkov translated tactical coordinates into even grammatical structures. The concept of advancing from concealed positions became a phrase describing how Arctic foxes emerge from winter dens. Artillery concentration points transformed into words his grandmother used for locations where caribou gathered during spring migration. The encryption was not mathematical. It was cultural. Petrov monitored Japanese radio chatter through his secondary receiver. The enemy intercept stations had detected their transmission within minutes, exactly as expected. Directional finding equipment across Manchuria and northern Japan began triangulating their position, feeding data to cryptographic units in Tokyo and Harbin. But the Japanese codebreakers faced an impossible task. Their linguistic specialists could identify Germanic patterns, recognize Slavic structures, even decode Arabic or Turkish military communications. They had compiled extensive dictionaries of Soviet military terminology, cataloged thousands of Russian idioms, memorized the grammatical peculiarities of Ukrainian and Belarusian dialects. None of them had ever encountered a single word of even. The language belonged to the Tungusic family, related distantly to Manchu but separated by centuries of independent development. Its speakers lived scattered across territories larger than Western Europe, connected by reindeer migration routes and salmon fishing seasons rather than roads or railways. No even language materials existed in Japanese libraries. No linguistic scholars had documented its grammar for academic study. Volkov continued the transmission, weaving Soviet artillery positions into descriptions of traditional hunting grounds. The concept of flanking maneuvers became a phrase his uncle used to describe how hunters approached seal breathing holes on spring ice. Defensive perimeters transformed into words for the circular arrangements of reindeer during severe storms. Through his headphones, Petrov detected increased activity from Japanese monitoring stations. Their signal analysis equipment was recording everything, feeding raw data to teams of cryptographers who would spend sleepless nights searching for patterns. They would apply every technique developed during 4 years of Pacific warfare: frequency analysis, substitution matrices, mathematical probability calculations. All of it would prove useless. The blizzard intensified, snow accumulating against their radio shelter's wooden walls. Petrov adjusted the antenna orientation, maintaining clear signal propagation toward the Soviet Far East. Their message was traveling through atmospheric layers disrupted by solar activity and temperature gradients. But the even linguistic framework remained intact within the electromagnetic carrier wave. Volkov concluded the transmission with traditional Soviet military authentication protocols, masking the indigenous language content within conventional administrative formatting. To any intercepting station, the communication would appear to be standard operational traffic, encrypted through mathematical methods rather than linguistic subterfuge. 4,000 kilometers eastward, another even speaker received their transmission. Captain Nina Kravchenko had grown up in the same Kamchatka Peninsula communities as Volkov, learning traditional hunting songs alongside Soviet military doctrine. Her fluency in both languages made her indispensable to the Far East Command's intelligence operations. Kravchenko translated the even phrases back into Russian tactical terminology, revealing precise coordinates for German defensive positions around Königsberg. The intelligence would reach Soviet artillery units within hours, enabling targeted bombardments against previously unknown strongpoints. Meanwhile, Japanese cryptographers began their futile analysis. They would identify the transmission's electromagnetic signature, plot its geographical origin, measure its duration and frequency characteristics. But the linguistic content would remain as impenetrable as the Siberian forests, where even speakers had preserved their ancestral vocabulary for millennia. The wooden cipher wheel had served its purpose once again, not through mechanical complexity, but through cultural invisibility. The Japanese intelligence services possessed extensive resources, skilled linguists, advanced radio equipment, detailed knowledge of Soviet military procedures. They lacked only one element: access to languages that existed beyond their strategic imagination. Petrov began dismantling the radio equipment as the blizzard reached its peak intensity. Tomorrow they would relocate to new coordinates, continuing their systematic transmission schedule. The Japanese monitoring stations would follow their signals across East Prussia, recording everything while understanding nothing. The cipher wheel disappeared into Volkov's equipment pack, its wooden surface bearing no visible indication of the revolutionary encryption method it contained. Carved from birch trees that grew near his childhood home, it carried the weight of linguistic traditions that predated both Soviet ideology and Japanese imperial ambitions. Snow continued falling as they prepared to abandon their position, covering the traces of equipment that had transmitted unbreakable messages across a continent where two empires prepared for their final confrontation. The static crackled through Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Petrov's headset as morning frost formed patterns on the radio equipment inside the bunker near Stalingrad. October 23, 1942. The Wehrmacht's intercepted transmissions buzzed with increasing frequency, their operators growing more aggressive in their attempts to decode Soviet communications. Petrov adjusted the frequency dial with practiced precision. Across the cramped underground chamber, Senior Sergeant Marina Kozlova hunched over her telegraph key, her fingers dancing across the brass contacts with mechanical rhythm. The familiar Morse pattern emerged through the interference, dots and dashes that would mean nothing to German cryptographers, yet carried vital intelligence about troop movements along the Volga. The cipher system they employed had evolved from an unexpected source. 3 months earlier, when regular encryption methods proved vulnerable to enemy code breakers, Kozlova had proposed incorporating elements from her grandmother's traditional folk songs. The melodic patterns of ancient Siberian lullabies now formed the foundation of an unbreakable code. Each transmission began with a musical phrase, converted to Morse intervals. A particular rhythm indicated tank positions. Extended notes signaled artillery coordinates. The enemy intercepted every signal, recording each transmission with methodical German efficiency, yet the cultural barrier proved insurmountable. Petrov monitored the German radio chatter through his secondary receiver. Their frustration leaked through the static. Requests for additional cryptanalysts, demands for more sophisticated decoding equipment, urgent appeals to Berlin for assistance. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin had reportedly offered their own code-breaking expertise, confident that their experience with complex Asian linguistic patterns would unlock Soviet secrets. They remained unaware that the key lay not in mathematical algorithms or linguistic analysis, but in the preserved memories of Russian grandmothers. Kozlova completed her transmission and removed her headset. The bunker's oil lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows across detailed maps of the surrounding battlefield. Red marks indicated enemy positions based on intercepted communications. Blue symbols showed friendly forces. their locations encoded in the very folk melodies that once helped children sleep through long winter nights. "The Germans are relocating their monitoring station," Petrov announced, studying the decoded intelligence reports. "Closer to our position, they've detected our transmission source." The weight of their situation pressed against the bunker walls. Discovery meant capture or death. Yet maintaining communications remained essential for coordinating the defense of Stalingrad. Soviet commanders depended on their encrypted reports to position reinforcements and artillery support. Kozlova examined her grandmother's leather-bound songbook, its pages worn thin from decades of handling. Each melody contained specific emotional markers: joy, sorrow, anticipation, warning. These feelings, when translated into transmission patterns, created a code based on human experience rather than mathematical formulas. The Japanese cryptographers in Berlin possessed sophisticated equipment and centuries of experience with complex writing systems. Their reputation for breaking seemingly impossible codes had earned them respect throughout the Axis intelligence community. Yet they approached Soviet transmissions with purely analytical methods, searching for patterns within the signals themselves, rather than understanding their cultural origins. Petrov received confirmation that their latest intelligence package had reached division headquarters successfully. Tank movements predicted through their folk song cipher had allowed Soviet forces to anticipate German attacks along 3 separate fronts. Artillery strikes coordinated through musical patterns had disrupted enemy supply lines throughout the previous week. The radio crackled again. German voices discussed plans for a concentrated assault on suspected Soviet communication centers. Petrov translated their conversation while Kozlova prepared another transmission, her fingers selecting a melody her grandmother had hummed while kneading bread during harvest season. The song's rhythm encoded coordinates for emergency ammunition drops. Its emotional cadence indicated urgency levels for different sectors of the battlefield. The German monitoring equipment recorded every note, storing the data for analysis by their most skilled cryptographers and their Japanese allies. None of them could decode a grandmother's lullaby. As night approached, Kozlova began her final transmission of the day. The familiar melody emerged through the static. A song about snow falling on distant mountains, now carrying intelligence about enemy troop concentrations and supply routes. Her grandmother's voice seemed to guide her fingers across the telegraph key, each note precisely timed, each pause carrying meaning that transcended language barriers. The Germans would analyze this transmission for hours, applying mathematical formulas and linguistic theories. The Japanese would contribute their expertise with symbolic interpretation and pattern recognition. Together, they would fail to understand that the code's strength lay not in its complexity, but in its connection to something they could never access: the preserved cultural memory of Russian families. Petrov monitored their responses. Frustration grew in the German transmissions. Reports to Berlin became increasingly urgent. The Japanese attachment requested additional time and resources. None of them suspected that the unbreakable Soviet code existed not in sophisticated encryption algorithms, but in the simple melodies that Russian children had learned for generations. The folk songs continued carrying their secrets through the static, protected by cultural barriers that no enemy cryptographer could breach. The static crackled through Dmitri's headphones with familiar persistence. Dawn painted the frozen landscape around Stalingrad in shades of ash and copper. February 1943, pressing against the makeshift radio bunker with a silence that carried weight. Soviet flags drooped motionless in the still air, their red fabric darkened by months of battle debris. If you're fascinated by untold wartime communications, stay with us to discover how code became salvation. Dmitri adjusted the frequency dial with practiced precision, his fingers moving across the controls without conscious thought. The Morse patterns flowing through his earpiece carried more than tactical updates. They held the mathematical poetry that Major Volkov had spent weeks drilling into their minds. Each encrypted sequence represented hours of careful preparation, transforming battlefield coordinates into algorithmic puzzles that would confound Japanese interceptors monitoring Soviet transmissions across the Eastern Front. The transmission log beside him recorded 17 successful communications since midnight. Every encoded message had reached its destination intact, carrying troop movements and supply requirements through electromagnetic pathways that Japanese cryptographers continued to analyze with growing frustration. Their intercept stations detected the signals clearly enough, but the content remained locked behind mathematical barriers that resisted conventional decryption methods. Nikolai emerged from the communication tunnel, his boots crushing ice crystals that had formed overnight. The leather-bound codebook pressed against his chest represented months of development work, each page containing number sequences generated through calculations that transformed ordinary Russian into incomprehensible streams of digits. He settled beside Dmitri's station and opened the manual to page 47, revealing the encryption matrix they would use for morning operations. "Central Command requests artillery coordinates for Sector 12, Dmitri announced, transcribing the incoming message onto grid paper. "Standard tactical update, position, strength estimates, ammunition requirements." Nikolai traced his finger down the conversion chart, matching each Cyrillic letter with its corresponding numerical value. The process required absolute accuracy. A single miscalculation would render the entire transmission meaningless to receiving operators. He began the transformation slowly, converting tactical Russian into strings of numbers that bore no resemblance to their original meaning. The mathematics underlying their encryption system relied on modular arithmetic principles that few Japanese analysts had encountered. Soviet cryptographers had adapted theoretical concepts from university mathematics departments, creating practical encoding methods that protected battlefield communications through computational complexity rather than traditional cipher wheels or substitution patterns. Dmitri transmitted the encoded coordinates using precise Morse rhythms, each number group separated by calculated pauses. Japanese listening posts recorded every dit and da with mechanical accuracy, adding the transmission to growing files of intercepted Soviet communications that filled storage rooms across occupied territories. Teams of analysts worked constantly to identify patterns within the numerical sequences, applying standard cryptographic techniques that yielded only statistical noise. The temperature inside their bunker remained steady despite external conditions. Insulation materials salvaged from damaged buildings created a microenvironment where delicate radio equipment could function reliably. Dmitri monitored signal strength indicators while Nikolai prepared additional encryption matrices for anticipated afternoon communications. Intelligence reports suggest Japanese stations are increasing intercept efforts, Nikolai mentioned, reviewing operational notes from headquarters. "Their monitoring equipment captures our transmissions clearly, but decryption attempts continue to fail." The strategic advantage provided by unbreakable communications extended beyond simple tactical coordination. Soviet commanders could discuss vulnerable positions, troop rotations, and supply shortages through radio channels without concern for intelligence leaks. This freedom allowed unprecedented operational flexibility, enabling rapid responses to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining absolute communication security. Dmitri received confirmation that morning coordinates had reached artillery units successfully. Gun crews positioned 5 kilometers southeast were adjusting their targeting based on encoded instructions, preparing concentrated fire missions against German positions identified through reconnaissance patrols. The entire coordination sequence had occurred through radio channels that Japanese monitors recorded but could not interpret. The encryption process required mental discipline that transformed routine communications into mathematical exercises. Each operator memorized number conversion tables and calculation procedures until encoding became automatic. This psychological preparation proved as important as technical training. Battlefield stress could not be allowed to interfere with cryptographic accuracy. Nikolai examined signal propagation charts that predicted optimal transmission windows based on atmospheric conditions. Ionospheric disturbances affected radio communications unpredictably, sometimes enhancing signal strength while creating interference during other periods. Successful operations required understanding these natural phenomena alongside mathematical encryption principles. The sound of distant artillery punctuated their concentration. Shells launched from coordinates they had transmitted minutes earlier. The mathematical abstractions contained within their encrypted messages translated into concrete battlefield effects, demonstrating the practical power of theoretical cryptography applied to military communications. Japanese intercept stations continued their monitoring activities throughout the morning, recording Soviet transmissions with methodical thoroughness. Teams of cryptographers analyzed the numerical patterns using established techniques, searching for repetitions or statistical anomalies that might reveal underlying linguistic structures. Their efforts produced detailed frequency analyses and correlation studies that filled technical reports without advancing actual decryption. Dmitri prepared for the next scheduled transmission, reviewing encryption procedures one final time. The codebook contained sufficient mathematical variations to prevent pattern recognition, even with extended analysis periods. Each page offered different numerical transformations, ensuring that identical tactical messages would produce completely different encrypted outputs when transmitted on subsequent occasions. The war continued around their isolated communication post, but the mathematics protecting their transmissions remained uncompromised. Soviet radio operators across the Eastern Front employed similar encryption methods, creating a secure communication network that frustrated enemy intelligence efforts while enabling unprecedented coordination between dispersed military units. As afternoon approached, new tactical requirements arrived from headquarters. Troop movement schedules that required immediate transmission to field commanders positioned beyond conventional courier range. The encryption process began again, transforming military Russian into numerical sequences that would travel through electromagnetic spectrum while revealing nothing to hostile listeners who detected every transmitted symbol. The static crackled through Lieutenant Yuri Volkov's headphones like ice breaking under pressure. 3 days had passed since the successful transmission to the 23rd Rifle Division, and now Colonel Nakamura's intelligence unit had positioned additional listening posts within 2 kilometers of the Soviet positions. The Japanese had grown desperate to decode what they assumed were standard military communications. Volkov adjusted the frequency dial on his R311 radio set, the familiar weight of the headphones settling against his temples. Outside the reinforced bunker, snow continued to fall on the Khalkhin Gol region, each flake carrying the metallic scent of approaching winter. The date was October 15th, 1939, and the undeclared war between Soviet and Japanese forces had reached a critical juncture. Across the frozen steppe, Sergeant Dmitry Petrov hunched over his own radio equipment in a camouflage position. His breath formed small clouds in the sub-zero air as he prepared the next transmission. The code they used seemed simple to any eavesdropper. Numbers, weather reports, supply requests. What the Japanese interceptors could never suspect was that each mundane phrase carried tactical intelligence disguised within indigenous dialect patterns from the Siberian taiga. Petrov's fingers found the Morse key. The brass felt cold enough to burn skin, but he had learned to ignore such discomforts. 3 short taps, 2 long ones, then a pause. To Japanese ears, this sounded like routine maintenance reports. In reality, it detailed the exact positions of 3 Type 97 medium tanks that had advanced during the night, information gathered by scouts who had crawled through frozen mud for 6 hours. The deception had evolved from necessity. 2 weeks earlier, Japanese cryptographers had successfully broken a Soviet field cipher, leading to the destruction of an entire artillery battery. Major Kozlov, the communications officer for the 36th Motorized Division, had recognized that conventional encryption methods would not suffice against Japanese code-breaking capabilities. The solution came from an unexpected source: a radio operator named Alexei Tornov, whose grandmother had taught him the hunting calls used by reindeer herders in the Chukotka region. Tornov demonstrated how specific tonal patterns, when embedded within standard radio procedures, could carry complex tactical information. A request for ammunition became troop movement data when spoken with particular emphasis on certain syllables. Weather reports transformed into artillery coordinates through subtle changes in cadence and breathing patterns between words. Now, as Volkov listened to Petrov's transmission, he decoded the hidden message with practiced ease. The Japanese had moved their main observation post to a ridge overlooking the Soviet supply route. Tank support would be needed within 12 hours to secure the passage. 3 companies of infantry had taken positions behind a series of destroyed buildings, their exact locations encoded within what sounded like a request for winter clothing. Colonel Nakamura's intelligence team recorded every transmission, their equipment capturing each frequency modulation and timing pattern. They analyzed the radio traffic using the most advanced cryptographic methods available to the Imperial Japanese Army. Charts covered their tables, showing frequency usage, transmission times, and operator habits. Yet the true meaning remained invisible to them, hidden not in mathematical complexity, but in the oral traditions of nomadic peoples who had never seen a radio. The irony was profound. Japanese military intelligence had correctly identified these transmissions as significant. The timing and frequency suggested coordination of major tactical movements. Their operators noted the unusual consistency in transmission patterns and the fact that these particular radio nets maintained communications even during intense combat operations. What they could not penetrate was the cultural barrier that protected each message. Volkov began his response, embedding details about Japanese artillery positions within what would sound like a report on equipment maintenance. He described the coordinates of 3 howitzer emplacements by referencing traditional fishing grounds along imaginary rivers. The range and bearing to each target became wind directions and seasonal migration patterns. Every word carried dual meaning, accessible only to operators whose shared knowledge passed down through generations of hunters and herders. The system's effectiveness lay in its organic nature. Unlike mechanical ciphers or mathematical codes, this method relied on cultural knowledge that could not be acquired through cryptanalysis. Japanese intelligence officers could intercept every transmission, record every frequency, and analyze every pattern, but they lacked the interpretive framework that gave meaning to the communication. As dawn approached on October 16th, the radio traffic intensified. Soviet forces prepared for a coordinated advance that would determine control of the entire sector. Petrov transmitted final positioning updates, his voice steady despite the artillery shells that had begun falling 300 meters from his position. Each word he spoke would guide tank formations through terrain that offered no second chances for tactical errors. The Japanese listening posts recorded everything with mechanical precision. Their analysis would show increased radio activity, suggesting imminent Soviet operations. They would correctly predict that major combat action would begin within hours. But they would remain blind to the specific details that might have allowed effective countermeasures, the exact timing, the precise objectives, the coordination between different Soviet units that would make their advance unstoppable. The static crackled through the frozen air of Stalingrad's northern sector. December 18, 1942. Snow accumulated on the bent antenna of Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov's radio equipment, each flake dissolving against the warm metal housing. 3 kilometers away, German reconnaissance units moved through the skeletal remains of Factory District, their boots crunching against debris that once manufactured tractors for collective farms. Petrov adjusted his headphones, the familiar weight pressing against ears already numb from the sub-zero temperature. His fingers, wrapped in fingerless wool gloves, moved across the transmission keys with practiced precision. The message waited in his mind. Coordinates for the 308th Rifle Division's counterattack, encoded in a system the Wehrmacht cryptographers had never encountered. Beside him, radio operator Dmitry Volkov transcribed intercepts from Japanese monitoring stations in Manchuria. The intelligence report spoke of frustrated enemy attempts to decode Soviet transmissions, particularly those originating from frontline radio units. What puzzled the Axis analysts most were the seemingly random patterns that defied traditional cryptographic analysis. "Contact established with 2nd Battalion," Petrov murmured, his breath forming small clouds in the bunker's frigid air. The underground position, carved from Stalingrad's frozen earth, housed the division's primary communications hub. Concrete walls, reinforced with salvaged steel beams, absorbed the distant rumble of artillery exchanges. The encoding system Petrov employed drew from his childhood in the Altai Mountains, where his grandmother had taught him the ancient songs of the Teleyut people. Each tactical instruction transformed into syllables that matched the tonal patterns of folk melodies, creating transmissions that sounded like fragmented musical phrases to enemy listeners. Volkov's pencil moved steadily across his notepad as another Japanese intercept came through their secondary receiver. The monitoring station at Harbin reported the same conclusion their German allies had reached. Soviet radio communications contained an unidentifiable linguistic structure that resisted all conventional decryption methods. "Artillery coordinates confirmed," Petrov transmitted, his voice carrying the melodic cadence that disguised tactical information as cultural expression. The receiving operator, positioned with advanced reconnaissance teams, had grown up in the same mountain region. To him, Petrov's transmission sounded like his own grandfather humming while repairing fishing nets. Outside their bunker, the Battle of Stalingrad entered its most critical phase. German forces pressed their final offensive toward the Volga, while Soviet defenders prepared counterattacks that would determine the city's fate. In this context, secure communications meant the difference between coordinated resistance and catastrophic defeat. The Japanese monitoring stations, established across Manchuria and northern China, maintained constant surveillance of Soviet military radio traffic. Their sophisticated equipment captured thousands of transmissions daily, forwarding the most significant intercepts to German cryptographic units for analysis. Yet the folk song encoding system remained impenetrable. Petrov received confirmation of message receipt from 3 separate units. His grandmother's lullabies, transformed into military communications, enabled coordination between forces that the enemy believed were operating independently. The irony was not lost on him. Songs meant to comfort children now carried instructions for artillery strikes. Volkov looked up from his transcription work. Tokyo Station reports increased frustration with what they're calling musical interference on our frequencies. The intelligence value of intercepted Japanese communications proved substantial. Soviet analysts learned that Axis forces had assigned their most experienced cryptographers to breaking the folk song transmissions, diverting resources from other intelligence operations. The enemy's confusion had become an unexpected strategic advantage. Petrov began encoding the next message, this one containing retreat routes for units facing overwhelming German pressure. His fingers found the transmission rhythm naturally, muscle memory combining with childhood songs to create an unbreakable cipher. The melody his grandmother sang while churning butter now provided escape coordinates for an entire regiment. The effectiveness of the system exceeded all expectations. Traditional military codes relied on mathematical patterns that could be analyzed and eventually broken through systematic effort. The folk song method drew from cultural knowledge so specific and regionally bound that outsiders lacked the cultural context necessary for comprehension. Japanese analysts had begun requesting cultural specialists familiar with Soviet ethnic minorities, but their efforts focused on major population groups rather than the dozens of smaller communities scattered across Siberia's vast territories. The Teleyut songs that Petrov employed represented knowledge held by perhaps 1,000 people across the entire Soviet Union. As midnight approached, Petrov completed his final transmission of the shift. The message confirmed successful artillery coordination that had disrupted German advance units attempting to reach the Volga's banks. His grandmother's songs, preserved through generations of oral tradition, had helped save Stalingrad's northern defenses. Volkov gathered his intelligence summaries for delivery to division headquarters. The reports documented continued Japanese monitoring efforts and their consistent failure to penetrate Soviet encoding methods. What the enemy heard as incomprehensible musical fragments were actually precise military instructions flowing between frontline units. Petrov packed his equipment carefully, protecting sensitive components from the cold that could crack vacuum tubes and freeze mechanical switches. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as German forces regrouped for another assault. But tonight's successful communications had given Soviet defenders crucial advantages. The folk song encoding system would continue operating throughout the Battle of Stalingrad, enabling coordination that surprised German commanders who believed Soviet forces were fighting without central direction. In monitoring stations across Manchuria, Japanese operators continued recording transmissions they could not understand, never suspecting that ancient mountain songs carried the tactical information that would help determine the war's outcome. The first reconnaissance plane appeared over Stalingrad at dawn on February 2, 1943. Its German pilots circled the devastated city twice before turning back toward the west, carrying news that would reach Berlin within hours. The Sixth Army had fallen silent, subscribed to witness untold stories from history's most decisive moments. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov stood in the ruins of what had been the Central Communications Building, watching Soviet engineers reconnect the main radio transmission lines. The static-filled airways that had carried his encoded messages for months now hummed with victory reports and casualty assessments. The Navajo code system had completed its final mission on the Eastern Front. The metallic taste of cordite still lingered in the air, mixing with the acrid smoke rising from scattered fires throughout the city. Petrov's hands moved methodically across the radio equipment, documenting frequencies and cipher keys for the official after-action report. Each notation represented weeks of transmitted coordinates, supply requests, and tactical updates that Japanese intelligence had never deciphered. Captain Dmitry Volkov emerged from the basement command post, carrying a leather satchel filled with decoded intercepts. His weathered face bore new lines carved by months of sleepless nights, but his eyes held the steady focus of a man who understood the weight of secrets. The intercepted Japanese communications painted a clear picture. Their code breakers had identified Soviet transmission patterns, analyzed signal strengths, even tracked individual radio operators by their Morse code signatures. They had never suspected that critical battle messages traveled through an entirely different linguistic framework. The February wind carried the sound of distant engines as supply trucks began their careful approach through cleared minefields. Volkov placed the satchel on Petrov's makeshift desk, opened it, and withdrew a single sheet of decoded text. The document contained a Japanese intelligence summary dated January 28th, describing Soviet radio transmissions as increasingly sophisticated but following predictable encryption protocols. Petrov studied the translation, noting how Japanese analysts had cataloged every aspect of Soviet communications except the one that mattered most. They had recorded transmission times, power levels, and antenna configurations. They had mapped radio networks and identified command hierarchies. The Navajo speakers embedded within these networks had remained completely invisible. A Red Army signals officer entered the building, saluting before approaching their position. He carried orders transferring both men to new assignments. Petrov to a communications training facility near Moscow, Volkov to the Intelligence Analysis Center in Kuibyshev. The Navajo program would continue, but its deployment would shift to other fronts where Japanese forces maintained active listening posts. Volkov closed the satchel and secured its leather straps. The metallic taste that had marked their months in Stalingrad would fade, but the knowledge contained in these documents would reshape Soviet communications doctrine for years to come. They had proven that linguistic camouflage could operate as effectively as any electronic encryption, providing security through cultural invisibility rather than mathematical complexity. The sounds of reconstruction began earlier each day as February progressed. Hammers rang against steel, generators rumbled to life, and radio operators tested newly installed equipment. Petrov supervised the dismantling of their emergency transmission post, carefully packing each component while ensuring that no trace of Navajo-related materials remained behind. Their final transmission had carried a simple message: artillery coordinates for a German position threatening evacuation routes. The response had arrived within minutes, confirming target acquisition and successful engagement. Japanese radio interceptors had recorded both messages, adding them to files that would puzzle intelligence analysts for months afterward. Volkov watched a convoy of supply trucks navigate the cleared streets, their drivers following routes marked by Soviet engineers. The successful defense of Stalingrad had required countless individual decisions, from strategic planning to tactical execution. The Navajo code system had supported these decisions by ensuring that critical information reached commanders without revealing operational intentions to enemy listeners. A communications technician approached with the final equipment manifest, requesting signatures before shipping materials to their next deployment location. Petrov signed each form, noting how standard bureaucratic procedures concealed the extraordinary nature of their recent work. The official records would describe routine signals intelligence activities, making no mention of Navajo speakers or linguistic encryption methods. The metallic taste finally began to fade as clean February air replaced the smoke-heavy atmosphere that had dominated the city for months. Petrov breathed deeply, feeling the sharp cold that signaled winter's persistence despite changing tactical circumstances. Their next assignment would bring new challenges, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Effective communication required not just secure transmission methods, but also cultural understanding of enemy capabilities and limitations. Volkov sealed the last of their classified materials in a regulation storage container, affixing security tape and classification markings according to established procedures. The container would travel to Moscow under armed escort, joining other intelligence assessments in the growing archive of lessons learned from the Eastern Front experience. The reconstruction sounds grew louder as work crews expanded their operations throughout the devastated city. Radio antennas sprouted from newly stabilized buildings, creating a communications network that would support the massive logistical effort required to consolidate territorial gains. The Navajo speakers who had operated within this network had returned to their regular assignments, carrying with them the knowledge that their linguistic skills had contributed to one of the war's most decisive victories. Petrov conducted a final inspection of their former workspace, ensuring that no classified materials remained behind. The basement walls still bore chalk marks from their operational planning sessions, but these traces contained no information that could compromise ongoing security measures. Their most sensitive work had existed only in spoken form, transmitted through radio waves and decoded by listeners who shared a cultural heritage unknown to enemy intelligence services. A military transport truck arrived to collect their personal equipment and classified materials. The driver, a young corporal with Siberian features, saluted properly but showed no curiosity about their activities or destination. This professional discretion had characterized every aspect of the Navajo program, from initial recruitment through final deployment. Volkov climbed into the truck's passenger compartment, settling beside the sealed containers that held months of intelligence analysis. The metallic taste had completely disappeared, replaced by the clean scent of fresh snow beginning to fall across the city. Their work in Stalingrad had ended, but the principles they had validated would continue influencing Soviet communication security for years to come. The truck departed through cleared streets, passing construction teams working to restore essential infrastructure. Petrov watched the city recede through a small rear window, noting how quickly normal life reasserted itself once military operations concluded. The radio networks that had carried their encoded messages would soon carry routine administrative traffic, weather reports, and civilian communications. Japanese intelligence analysts would continue studying Soviet transmission patterns, searching for encryption methods that had never existed. Their detailed files would grow thicker with each intercepted message, Yet the fundamental mystery would remain unsolved. The Navajo code system had achieved its primary objective, protecting critical military communications through linguistic invisibility rather than technological sophistication. The transport truck reached the outskirts of Stalingrad as afternoon light began to fade. Volkov opened his personal notebook and wrote a final entry documenting their deployment conclusion. The metallic taste was now completely gone, but its memory would always connect him to those crucial months when unbreakable messages had helped determine the course of the Eastern Front. Snow continued falling as they traveled toward their new assignments, covering the landscape in pristine white that concealed the scars of recent battles. Their success had proven that effective military communication depended not just on technical security measures, but also on understanding the cultural limitations of enemy intelligence capabilities. The Japanese had never known, and now they never would,